Our third speaker is the Executive Director of War on Want, John Hilary. War on Want are a fantastic organisation because they're a political organisation that know that poverty is political. And they don't just look at the symptoms of poverty, they look at the causes. And we've worked with John and his team on a number of issues like the windfall tax, on the utilities, on things like companies law reform. And they're a breath of fresh air in terms of their style, their campaigning ability, their motivation. As I say, this notion, this idea that's central that we have to address the causes of poverty and not just the symptoms. And I'm really pleased that John is here to talk to us this morning. Thank you, John.
Neil, thank you very much. It's very much my privilege to be here this morning. Also my privilege to speak after a Cabinet Minister, after you, Harriet. I think the normal protocol is that the Cabinet Minister speaks at the end, and certainly listening here, I understand why, because I was so concentrated on what you were saying, I've rather forgotten what I was here to say myself. But I think partly I was very heartened to hear again that sense that the Labour government has really listened to the message from the country and has heard the depth of anger which has come from ordinary working people across Britain in the last couple of weeks. The concern that I have and that War on Want has is that the Labour government maybe hasn't heard the depth of the desire for radical change, for a profound change in the global economy. Because while we may be hearing now from the financial commentators and the bankers that the recession seems to be coming to an end and it was shorter than we thought it might be, in the real world we still know that hundreds of thousands more British workers are going to lose their jobs, that tens of millions more European workers are going to lose their jobs, and for War on Want, looking particularly to the people of the developing world, hundreds of millions more people are going to be forced into global poverty, despair as a result of this recession. So the message has got to be it's not enough to paper over the cracks in a system via fiscal stimuluses or bailout for bankers, but we need to sort out the structural imbalances in the global economy which have got us into this mess. And that's why my first point is that there must be no turning back to the economics of the past. Because even before this crisis hit, we know that globalization had failed the majority of the world's population. The World Bank, which is one of the great cheerleaders for globalization over the past 30 years, was forced to admit last year that it had got its figures completely wrong. And rather than globalization bringing prosperity to millions, in fact, there are still 1.4 billion people, that's 1,400 million people, living not in poverty, but in extreme poverty around the world. That's what it means to be poor in a country like Niger or Chad or Mali, where 1 in 4 children die before their 5th birthday, and 1 in 20 women die as a result of pregnancy or childbirth. And despite that awful record, that condemnation of 30 years of neoliberal globalization, we were very, very saddened to see the G20 summit in April this year, led by Gordon Brown, going straight back to the policies of old. Instead of embracing a more progressive, forward-looking economic model, we went back to more free trade, more free markets, and more deregulation. And we handed back control of the global economy to the International Monetary Fund, to the World Bank, and to the World Trade Organization, the unholy trinity of organizations which have actually got us into the mess in the first place. So what we need in terms of the economy, we need a new start, a new beginning based on new principles, where capital and finance and trade are devoted to public benefit, not to private profit, where we have a massive program of redistributive justice to deal with the inequalities that we've heard about, both nationally and internationally, and when we take back democratic control of the institutions which govern us, whether that be the banks in this country or saying to the G8, the G20, the exclusive clubs, no, we want to go back to the United Nations and the principles of inclusivity and democracy. But if there can be no going back to the economics of the past, we also do not want to go back to the politics of the past. And here I'm afraid I have to talk about the 12 years record of the Labour government, because War and Want was born out of the Labour movement. We were founded by a Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, almost 60 years ago. And yet, over the course of this government, we found ourselves on almost every single issue lined up in opposition to the Labour government. And that's profoundly problematic. Take, for example, the issue of trade, where War and Want and others have called for trade justice. The government has called for more free market trade, for more trade liberalisation, and more powers to corporations in the global economy, despite the fact that we know that costs millions of jobs around the world. On finance, where we've called for tax justice, for proper regulation of the banks, for capital controls to be introduced, Labour has again called for deregulation, exactly the deregulation of financial markets which has caused the current crisis. And I'm sorry to say that the government continues to call for more deregulation, both in the multilateral talks which are going on at the moment and in the bilateral negotiations with developing countries. And on public services, we've joined with the public sector trade unions calling for public services to remain in public hands, affordable, accessible, and high quality for all people. But yet again, on the international stage, the Labour government has done more than any other country to push for the privatisation of public services, using hundreds of millions of pounds of British aid money to go to privatisation consultants like PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, or even the Thatcherite Adam Smith Institute. You couldn't make it up, really. So these are the key issues here. But on the single most important, the defining global justice issue of our time, Palestine, Labour has, I'm afraid, again sided with the oppressor against the oppressed. And just as Tony Blair 3 years ago refused to condemn the bombing of Lebanon, which caused over 1,000 civilian casualties, so too this time David Miliband refused point blank to condemn the Israeli assault on Gaza at the beginning of this year, which led to over 1,400 Palestinian dead, including many hundreds of women and children. And instead of that, we have been rewarding the Israeli government for its aggression at every step of the way, rewarding them with millions of pounds worth of arms exports, which they have been able to use in this aggression, rewarding them also with the trade preference which Israel enjoys. And just next week, David Miliband's going over to Brussels to meet again with the far-right Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman in order to talk about upgrading further EU-Israel relations. This simply is unacceptable, and we cannot allow it to happen. But if there's no turning back to the economics and the politics of the past, how do we move forward? How do we move forward to a progressive future together? And I believe that this means going beyond factional party politics towards a movement politics, building a movement which joins together all of us behind a vision not just a calculation of what's possible or achievable today, but a vision of what's needed for tomorrow. And that's a vision based on social justice. It's a vision based on environmental sustainability. It's got to be an internationalist vision, because we don't want to get drawn into the traps of British jobs for British workers, which then comes back to us on a leaflet dropped through my door by the BNP the week before last. We believe in decent jobs for all workers, British, Polish, Italian, Indian, Chinese, wherever they may be. And we've started building that movement. We've started building that movement for progressive change. At the end of last year, in the run-up to the G20 summit in April, together, War and Want, together with all the major trade unionists, including the CWU, the TUC, and all the others, all of the campaigns groups, including Compass and many others, the environmental groups, the faith groups, a broad coalition of well over 100 different organizations, we put together the Put People First coalition.